A little bit late. Not as late as we have been in the past, though, so, it's all relative. Today, we are talking about anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism and the philosophies of Jeremy Corbyn when it comes to international politics. To do so, I am joined by David Waring. You are a teaching fellow at the Royal Holloway University.
Correct.
And you've got a book coming out about Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, about Britain's relationship with Saudi Arabia.
What's it going to be called?
It's going to be called Anglo-Arabia, Why Gulf Wealth Matters to Britain. Don't ask me what Anglo-Arabia is.
You're also kind of a regular contributor to Novara.
Yeah, regular.
I'd like it to be more regular. Can we sort that out?
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
I'm also joined by Huda Elmi.
Hello.
Who is standing to be on the NEC, Labour's National Executive Committee.
Exciting.
And you're already on a committee, aren't you? The regional board.
In the West Midlands.
In the West Midlands.
Yes.
Fabulous. How are you both?
Not bad.
Fantastic.
All the better
Fantastic.
for the fact they serve beer at Novara.
Exactly. And seeing you.
Oh,
Yeah,
thanks,
that
guys.
as well. Yeah, sorry.
That was the correct line, David. We are obviously having this discussion about Corbyn's foreign policy after another month of completely trumped up scandals. The first of those was about how Labour should police discussions of Israel. I am demonstrating that debate or talking about that debate in kind of a specific way, but I do think that when it comes to the IHRA, that is what is in question. We might touch upon that in a little bit. More recently, it is about whether brief at some leaders of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. The response from the Labour leadership has been somewhat, let's say, it's a bit lost in the weeds. So we've had 2 weeks of discussing whether he was by this gravestone or that gravestone, whether he just held a wreath, whether he just laid a wreath. And you can understand why, as the Labour leadership's press team, you would spend a lot of time trying to be precise about details when you're surrounded by a media, by a press that is willing to misrepresent everything, that doesn't have any real commitment to telling the truth. But at the same time, I'm probably not alone in finding this all hella boring. So today we're not going to measure the distance that Corbyn was standing from any particular grave. We're not going to look at the angle he was leaning at when he was holding a wreath. Was he just holding it? Was he just laying it? We're not sure. We're going to look at the broader philosophies that underlie Corbyn's past and Corbyn's international associations and commitments. So the first question for you both. Let me just scroll down slightly. What do the rows of the last month tell us about Corbyn? Could the party have dealt with these scandals in a bolder way? David?
I think they could, yeah. I think the level of competence and professionalism is variable when it comes to leadership. I think they dealt with the last election really well and transformed my view of how they're managing things. And this most recent stuff, perhaps less so, like with the definition and the examples connected to it. I don't think they've done much wrong in terms of redrafting those examples. I think they've done it right, actually, but I'm surprised they didn't consult with people properly. They would probably still have had a lot of opposition, but that just seemed like an unnecessary angle. And with this stuff in terms of the wreath, I think seeing as it was so clear that there was going to be these kind of attacks on Corbyn, someone should have sat him down, gone through all the things he's been doing in the recent past and say, right, someone could come at us with that, let's just get our facts straight. So when they attack us, we can set out what the facts are. And when the story came out the other day, it seems to take them a long time to get their story out, which is
the man,
which is
67 though, kept himself pretty busy. I can't think of a
did,
cause he
yeah.
has not turned up to their demo about.
But they should be prepared for this stuff, and they didn't look prepared for it at all, to be honest. But that aside, how you respond to being smeared, and it looks like a smear now. It looks like that story with regard to the reef seems to be collapsing. The bigger story is the fact that you are being attacked unfairly, and I think he was attacked unfairly for that. But you've still got to respond to it in a, perhaps a bit more professional manner. But like you say, the ins and outs of that story are getting dull, and there's bigger things to talk about, I think.
Yeah. We're going to talk about those bigger things. So, I mean, I kind of, I can see why if you were in Corbyn's team, you wouldn't necessarily want to look through every fucking demo he's ever been on in his life. And I feel like it takes so long to get around all the details of every single picture he's ever appeared in. So I'm kind of hoping what we're going to do tonight is fit that into a broader narrative, into a broader picture of why he was even at that ceremony in the first place. That's something that was completely elided by the media, who just sort of like to think of him as turning up to celebrate a bunch of terrorists instead of seeing it as the official liberation struggle of the Palestinian people. But anyway, we're going to get onto that. Huda.
I just think, I don't know what I find most insulting, the fact they think that, in terms of the gutter press, the fact that they think that ordinary people are really, really gullible, or the fact they use paint to like try and figure out all these different distances and the circles and the arrows. Like it was Microsoft Paint they were using, and I was just like, I can't even handle. You don't even know what Photoshop is. Like this is getting.
Who was using paint? I want to get that up. Was that?
I mean, the gutter press. I mean, Daily Mail definitely were. Like it was so obvious, the circles and everything. I was just like, I can't handle it.
Oh, I see what you mean with the circles.
Exactly. It was like 2018. But I think it does raise really important questions about where the establishment media is sort of heading. And I know that obviously we have amazing news outlets now like Novara Media and just sort of like emerging. No, but we have like emerging press, and ordinary people now have so much more agency in terms of defining what is news and what isn't news, encountering in real time what people say. And you've sort of got this massive kind of unraveling of establishment media now into just sort of like sensationalist clickbait, and it gets to a point where I think we really have to question their responsibility and our responsibility also in challenging them and really holding them to account. And I know that Corbyn has sort of started legal action, hasn't he? Or it came out that apparently he was going to report them at least to the watchdog or whatever.
He's gone to IHRA, hasn't he?
But I just think, is that what's going to have to happen every single time they run a story? I think there has to be a certain level of a baseline of understanding that this is it. This you can't go any lower than this, and you have to have a responsibility as a news media outlet. You have to kind of try to have a semblance of some kind of pride in what you do, and not treat ordinary people like completely gullible human beings.
Well, it's funny, every time any one of these scandals comes up in the media, there's a bunch of people on Twitter who say, this is Corbyn's Trump moment. If people don't leave him now, this is really when he could, like Donald Trump, say, I could shoot someone in the street and my fans would still support me. It's like, you really don't get it. After 3 years, you know, there's hundreds of thousands of people who see Jeremy Corbyn as their only hope for a better future, for a more just world, for a policy which is to some degree anti-imperialist, and you know, so we don't have another few decades of war and blah 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 blah. And they think that we're going to see one weird local story about him. I mean, local in the sense of specific, not like it happens nearby. About him bending down too low, or him sort of standing next to someone with a dodgy past. And you really think that we're going to give all this up because this man who we've seen attacked for 3 years stood next to someone who'd done something wrong or complicated, or we don't even need to get into that. But I mean, this is not what people care about. Is the project.
Exactly.
And you have to prove to people that the project is not what they thought it was, rather than show them a picture of Jeremy Corbyn standing near someone in the past.
It's easier to sort of think of everything as this singular human being, but not realising that there is this collective spirit. There's a whole bunch of people who subscribe to an ideology and subscribe to what he's talking about and the leftist politics that he represents, which all of us represent, rather than, because it's easy to sort of think of everything as one person, because then you just take that one person down, don't you? And then everything kind of fades away. But that's not how leftist politics is built, and it can't ever be.
It's not even just his supporters who haven't abandoned him as a result of this thing in Tunis. It's the public. If you look at, I mean, maybe we'll find in polls in the next few days that support has fallen away, but as far as I can see from the polls that have come out over the last few days, Labour are just where they were before. So it's not just Labour Party members or members of this Corbyn cult that exists in the minds of centrists. It's the public. 13 million people voted Labour last time, and they've not gone anywhere. So I think his critics need to start asking themselves why that is. I think one of the reasons the public haven't abandoned him over this is that they look at Corbyn and they don't see an extremist. They see a perfectly recognisable type in British society, a baby boomer who came of age in the 60s, grew up during the time of the peace movement, Vietnam, CND and all the rest of it, and is shaped by that, who is, if not an absolutist pacifist and someone who has basic sort of, you know, pacifisty, peacenik type credentials. We all know someone like that, even if we're right-wing, we know someone like that. A lot of us are of that kind of trend in progressive society, and those people don't tend to support terrorist actions against innocent people, against civilians. They just don't. The idea that this guy would have supported Munich and been a big fan of Black September just strikes me as laughable. It may have. The worst you would think at the beginning of that so-called scandal is, okay, he made a mistake in standing next to the wrong grave or whatever, not realise what he was doing at the time because it's all in Arabic, he doesn't speak Arabic, whatever. But the idea that he thought, Munich, that was terrific, Black September, great bunch of lads, I'm all in favour of that. It's just, it doesn't pass the laugh test. And it doesn't pass the laugh test not just for Labour members, but millions of people at home,
Huda, you look like you.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that, and I think that there just needs to be a raising of consciousness in terms of what media are doing, and I think holding them all to account, because I just think it's terrible, and it's only going to get worse if they're allowed to get away with it. And what the story's going to be next? Corbyn kicks cats. Like, where is this going to end? And I think it does speak to a wider struggle that we're having at the moment when it comes to trying to get our perceptions and our lines and our ability to be able to communicate beyond just sort of Twitter bubbles, beyond just sort of like small media outlets, to actually reach people. I think that is a question that we're going to have to answer.
I'm going to ask you the next big question in a second, but you've just mentioned small media outlets. You know what I'd like Novara Media to be? A really fucking big media outlet. So if you'd like to see us become a big media outlet, we won't just talk about the angles at which people are bending and the distance they are to certain graves. We will talk about the big issues so that the public can understand what is going on, which our current media environment is abjectly failing to do. So please go to support.novaramedia.com to help a new media for a new politics, different media. I've forgotten my own tagline. What can you do? Anyway, one fairly common response, and quite reasonable response, I think, but it's come from across the spectrum. So Stephen Bush, what's your lad at The Guardian, Jonathan Friedland, Gary Young. Lots of people are coming out and saying now is the time for Corbyn to lay out his foreign policy. If you want to get out of the weeds of detail, you have to give an overarching narrative. So David, if that comes, what is Jeremy Corbyn's foreign policy?
I kind of feel like he's done this already and maybe people haven't been paying attention. So today I went back to the big speeches that he's given. He does need to do it. He needs to keep doing it. He needs to keep explaining and arguing because he's bringing a new political programme, so you need to make the case for it. If you look back, last year he made 3 speeches which I think were really important. The first one was in May at Chatham House, his big establishment foreign policy think tank, where he set out his defence and foreign policy sort of vision, this word defence policy, military policy, whatever. A few days later, after the Manchester bombings, he gave another speech. It's less of a set-piece speech, more of a response. And he set out what his view was about the relationship between Western foreign policy and terrorism. And he gave another speech in Geneva in December of last year, which was about Britain's relationship with the global south. I think it's worth people Googling those and have a look at them. They're really quick to read. And what strikes me when reading them back is there's nothing radical in them, really. So if anyone who studied international relations, I assume a few people at home have done it at uni, a lot of it fits within the liberal tradition in terms of principles, like not within the liberal tradition in terms of how liberals have run states at all, but in terms of basic principles, multilateralism, international law, taking these big institutions like the UN seriously, the use of force as a last resort rather than the first resort, the importance of diplomacy, stuff like that. This all fits within, it's not radical, it's not world revolution, it's not everyone take up arms, it's quite mild stuff. So I think people, if they read those speeches, will be wondering, well, where's this dangerous radical supporter of X, Y and Z horrible armed group that I'm being told about? Because this guy just looks quite normal, I mean, some of the positions in these speeches, like which is set out in the manifesto as well, about 2% of the GDP being spent on the military, membership of NATO, renewing Trident. We know those are positions that he doesn't really believe in. But generally, when he articulates this kind of multilateralist, in favour of international law, dialogue over conflict type vision, we know that's his authentic, sincere vision. That's the way he sees the world. And this stuff about recognising the role that British foreign policy and Western interventionism has played in exacerbating the terrorist threat, for example. I mean, that may be radical in Fleet Street, it may be radical in Westminster. For people like me who study this stuff, it's just normal. You know, recognising that role, that relationship is normal. It's mainstream in academia. Like, people might disagree about the extent to which that relationship is there or the nature of it, but again, there's nothing particularly radical about it. And I don't say it's not radical to be critical of it. I don't say it's not radical because I think that's a good thing. I get so frustrated with this debate, as we all do, about the nature of Corbyn's foreign policy. And I just think we should start by being accurate. Who is he actually? He is not this radical he's pretended to be. He's not... in this article that Ewan McCaskill did the other day about Jeremy Corbyn's foreign causes, a blessing or a curse. This is in the Guardian.
Probably get that article up.
Ewan McCaskill, Jeremy Corbyn's foreign causes, a blessing or a curse. And he goes through Corbyn's different foreign policy positions. And he interviews different people on Corbyn's side, opposed to him. And the message you keep getting through is this thing about him being a peacenik and not being a classic trot, not being a classic sort of apologist for the Soviet Union. They've got George Galloway in there being really sniffy about Corbyn. Oh, he's just some woolly Californian and all the rest of it. So, yeah, I think just let's try and be fair and accurate about this guy. And maybe this journalist should read his speeches before trying to characterise his foreign policy. Just do the public a service by getting accurate on it.
What journalist? Ewan McCaskill?
No, Ewan McCaskill, I think, has done a great job.
You mean the other ones? You mean the Dan Hodges of the world?
Oh, God.
You could name any number of them.
I don't know.
Yeah, you can't really call
You could
him
name
a
any
journalist.
number of them. But I think Ewan McCaskill was quite fair in that article. I think he was pretty good. He gave both sides, but he did it in a quite intelligent, balanced way.
Huda, when you look at Jeremy Corbyn, do you see an old hippie who just loves peace?
No, he has been consistent. He has been consistent, and this kind of just builds on what you were saying about the fact, the people that he stood for, the people he stood for in solidarity of. And I think it really is coached in larger terms of the struggles that he's been a part of, may it be apartheid, may it be Palestine, may it be, you know, Africa, and all these various different struggles that he's really, really stood for. They've all pretty much been erased, and I think that by doing so, you're kind of that's why it's so easy to remove him from that. It's because those things in and of themselves have been removed from kind of context, and we're not talking about them in very honest terms. And the parameters in which we're talking about them is obviously from the gaze of the West, that benefits from their exploitation and continues to benefit from their exploitation. I know we're going to be going on to imperialism and colonialism in a bit, but when we kind of look at those projects, they didn't end in you know, when independence came along. They continue to keep going, to keep trundling along, and it's under the radar. And so if you want to talk about Jeremy in a very honest way and the things that he stood for, you're going to have to then also honestly talk about the state of the world, and obviously they don't want to do that. And I think what's really, really important in all of this as well is that, I mean, even if we just use the example of Yemen, he's been the only consistent politician to come out and say that, you know, we need to stop selling arms and there's a humanitarian crisis happening there. And so he's definitely been very brave and consistent in his foreign policy. And there's there's a semblance and a group of people who clearly don't want to listen, because then they'd have to talk about everything else, and they'd have to really, you know, unpack the skeletons of what is going on in world politics and the role of Britain in that, the continued role of Britain in that.
So who are these people?
I think really, I mean, conservatives, I think would have to be talking about people who are Eurocentric in their view. I think would have to be talking about people who are neo-colonialists. Would have to be talking about all those various different people who benefit and continue to benefit and want to benefit from a neo-colonial perspective and a world in which the global south is continuing to be subjugated to the benefit of the West.
We can talk about the John Woodcocks, can't we? I mean, you wouldn't even be in the leading body of his party if you win, because he's left, he's gone. Tragic.
Sad exclamation mark.
I want to push down on this idea that Jeremy Corbyn can be characterised basically as a peacenik. So someone who's not particularly ideological, but looks at the world and says, it's kind of better when we don't have war. It's kind of better when we support people who are oppressed, as opposed to sort of like big imperial powers. I mean, I brought in imperial there, which gives the question away. I want to bore down on whether he is part of an ideology which has a bit more content than that, which is anti-imperialism.
Yeah.
And so the positive way of looking at anti-imperialism is that the biggest injustices in global politics are because you have the big, powerful states for the last 100 or so years. That's been the West, which exploit the poorer ones. And to be an anti-imperialist is to sort of support the weaker states in their defence against the strong ones who are trying to exploit them. The more negative view of anti-imperialism would be that you sort of take a kind of arbitrary set of alliances in global politics inside yourself with the non-Western one. So many people often try and insinuate or claim that Jeremy Corbyn is soft on Assad, soft on Putin, soft on people who commit just as many human rights abuses as the Israelis or the Saudis, for example, but whether or not he is vocal is dependent on where those countries fit in a global system of alliances. Which was kind of a long way of me asking you, what is imperialism, David? Or what is anti-imperialism?
So it's, I guess we have to, let's talk about it historically rather than theoretically. I think that's just more interesting.
Make it concrete.
Yeah, exactly. So think of the current international political economy, globalisation, the relationship between the global north and the global south as the product of historical processes. Think of that relationship between the global north and the global south. Who's got the power? Who's got the military power? Who's got the diplomatic power? Think about how states plug into the international political economy. Who sells primary commodities? Who sells basic manufacturers? Who sells high-tech manufacturers? Who sells services? Who plays what role economically? I think if you look at that, look at those balances of power, look at who plays what role economically, you see a world that was largely produced by the imperial era, the era of formal empire. And if you look at that, this modern era of world politics and world economics, capitalism, imperialism, formal empire covers most of that, actually. If you think of the modern world as starting in the late 1700s, early 1800s, let's say in the 1700s, in that broad sweep of history, the modern bit, the bit after formal empire, is pretty short, you know.
So that's what, 1945 onwards?
1960,
1970
onwards.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, British Empire goes right up into the 60s and 70s, you know, same with the French. So this has been a pretty short period. I was born in 76, so I'm only as old as this post-formal empire period, whereas the period of formal empire goes back centuries. So that's the long formative period of modern international relations and international political economy. You can't expect all that to just disappear overnight. So loads of it carries on. There's been lots of changes. You mentioned before this thing about, you know, you get independence if you're a global south country. That doesn't mean that the imbalances of power, that doesn't mean that the vulnerabilities in terms of your sovereignty, your ability to set your own economic policies, versus the ability of global north countries to tell you, no, you can't do that, you have to do this. That doesn't mean that all that's changed and you've suddenly got autonomy. You're still subject to international economic forces, big states who are able to violate your sovereignty via the IMF, through military intervention, etc., etc. So there's formal empire, where you exert direct control. There's colonialism, where you're literally sending your settlers onto a country and, you know, populating it with your people. And there's imperialism, which is related to those things, but it's about wider imbalances of power, about economic relations, and how the global south sovereignty is still violated, not just in terms of individual policies, but almost structurally by the economic and military power of the global north. And if you're against that, I think that's quite a good thing. I think if liberals were serious about their claimed principles, they would be anti-imperialist just by definition. Empire, imperialism, these are systems of violent coercion and exploitation. I don't see why any serious, sensible person with good moral values would be anything other than an anti-imperialist. It doesn't have to be. I don't see why it should be a radical left position. But I was saying a minute ago that Corbyn's policy position is not radical. That's true, but I think the things you were touching on a minute ago really speak to why there's such a hostile response, because what is radical shouldn't be radical, but is radical in the context of the execrable discourse that we have, is being anti-imperialist and crucially, seeing the West not as a benign force for good in the world, but the source of a lot of exploitation and violence, direct and structural violence, and seeing Britain's role historically as being one that's not necessarily something to be proud of. I don't believe in, you know, pride and shame in all these things, but lots of people see it as something to be proud of. And he takes a different approach. I think a lot of the hostility to Corbyn is down to the idea, which is really palpable in the political class. They see him as a traitor. I think that's what they're not happy about. They see him as a traitor to this belief that the West is a force for good in the world, and as opposed to the anti-imperialist view.
Huda, is the hostility to Jeremy Corbyn because he is Labour's first anti-imperialist leader?
He's a staunchly anti-imperialist leader, and I think that, particularly in today's context, and I think you've touched on very, very good points there, talking about this idea that we all love being liberal in a sense of, oh, isn't everything great? We love democracy, and all those abstract points that really don't materialise for the global south and are built on the continued exploitation of. And I think that Corbyn is somebody who, in standing up to that, is really standing up to a global order that will inevitably try and silence him, because it would be a complete end to how things are governed at the moment. And I think that when we talk about colonialism particularly, which I think we were moving on to...
Yeah, let's go to it. Let's go for it.
Yes.
You're liberated to talk about colonialism as much as you want now.
I know, I'm so excited. But it really, I mean, obviously it's inextricably linked to sort of imperialism. It's sort of mechanics. It's sort of mechanics of it. And I think it's the institutions of and particularly in an African context, I think the one thing that annoys me so much is that there's still this image, particularly in sort of like the turn of the 19th or the 20th century, that it was this chaotic scramble, and that there wasn't really any kind of like, there wasn't really anything tying it together in terms of policy and all that sort of stuff. But it really was systematic, and it wasn't just a scramble for sort of like labour and markets and other resources, but it was a cultural transplantation of sort of trying to take European customs and trying to plant them in a place where you could have that continued degradation of indigenous customs. And when we're sort of looking at it in today's world, it hasn't ended, and it continues to exist. And people like Corbyn, people like the Labour left, I mean, when we look at the British trade union movement, for instance, and how it has stood up against colonialism, how you have all kinds of trade union leaders going over during apartheid and meeting with Nelson Mandela as soon as he was released, and continuing that relationship with, again, Palestine and all these various different contexts. The struggle continues, but it has always been backed up by this idea that as leftists, as a trade unionist, as somebody in the labour movement, we have to stand shoulder to shoulder with this, because it is a struggle that connects all of us, and it's that internationalism that we have to be building and that we have to be building on. And I think that Corbyn symbolises that. He symbolises that tradition, and that tradition has come alive again, because there was a point where it really had fallen to the wayside, and was sort of not necessarily bought into, but it had been marginalised by this idea that we're perfect now. We're in a post-racial order, don't you know? And we're really, everywhere is democratic now because of us. And challenging that in an international sense, in a global sense, I mean, it's just powerful beyond words. And when we look at things, and what I would like to happen now is those linkages made, because I think what we were very good at doing in the 70s and the 80s, when we were like militant and radical in our support for anti-colonial struggle, we were sort of making those international linkages between what's happening here and how migrants are being demonised and how everywhere else, and sort of foreign policy initiatives that support this cycle almost of, we go in, we bomb a place, they end up having to move, they move over here, then we demonise them. I mean, Windrush, the fact that we are, sending home people who have worked here, who've built institutions here, it's linked again to that just degradation of racialised communities, and when our whole foreign policy is strung up on that fact, of course it's going to happen. Grenfell, similarly, this idea that we demonise and we ghettoise essentially racialised communities, that's all interlinked, and once you make those linkages, you see that domestic policy and foreign policy are one and the same, and we have to be treating them as though they're one and the same. You can't be amazing on the NHS and then terrible on on Palestine. It doesn't work like that. You have to be linking them up, because our struggle is an international struggle.
What does that look like in practice then? So if you look at sort of the current furore about the reef.
The reef.
One thing you could say by looking at that debate was that public or the voice of anti-colonial activists or anti-colonial actors or sort of an anti-colonial ideology is incredibly weak for weeks, or 2 weeks it's been now. A narrative was completely able to dominate whereby the PLO was simply just a bunch of terrorists. So there was no question whatsoever that maybe Corbyn was standing in solidarity with an anti-colonial struggle. There was this, even from the Labour Party, it was basically framed on the terms of some innocent people died in a hotel. Not a hotel. It was the HQ of the. Sorry, losing my words now. It was the HQ of the PLO in Tunis. But they didn't really make the sort of anti-imperial argument about it. They made the sort of 47 innocent people died in this building there, and he was there to commemorate the 47 innocent people there. And he sort of by accident went to the grave of the people who weren't innocent. and there was no narrative that really entered about the unequal power relations that existed between the Palestinian struggle and the Israelis. So do you feel like we've failed to make that connection between unequal power in anti-colonial struggles?
I think what's happened has been something that's been systematically happening since the onset of colonialism, and that has been the erasure of histories of those who are anti-colonial in their principles and those who are fighting the struggle currently. When you look at the Palestinian struggle, everything and this whole debate and this whole discourse only happens when you've completely erased their presence and our history of solidarity with them. And so I think it has to be about recentering. I think it has to be about bringing back and talking about Palestine and the fact that, for instance, the PLO is, it is recognised even within the UN, by the US, by Britain, as the representative of the Palestinian people. And a kind of recentering by talking about it in that way and kind of bringing back everything to the idea that this is a struggle that we've supported. It's a struggle that we have to continue to support because of our principles, but more so because it is a leftist struggle. It is all of our struggle. I mean, particularly if you look at BAME communities, it's very, very interesting because so many of us have that history embedded within us because we grew up around it. And we were talking earlier before this about the fact that, like, before, I was even the age of 5, I knew what Palestine was. I knew what that struggle was. I knew what Somalia was. I knew what that struggle was. And those histories, particularly, because of my Somali heritage, is something that's orally carried forth. And those principles are something that just continue from generation to generation to generation. And our detachment and our disassociation from that is the only reason as to why we talk about these things in such a negative vacuum. We really just have to recenter the people who we should be supporting, who we are fighting with, and we've fought with since the onset. And that is, in this particular instance, the Palestinian people and the Palestinian struggle. I mean, again, if we take this back to colonialism, it is one of the last sort of like settler colonial states that continues to exist. I mean, we talk about colonialism as being entirely over, and it's not. But when we talk about the sort of mechanisms and the machinations of an apparatus that is colonialism, I mean, what better example than Palestine currently in 2018?
David. No, I'm gonna ask you a concrete question.
Yeah. Okay.
I was just blown away. Sorry by that excellent answer. Vote for Huda, guys.
Already did.
Yeah. I'm going to get up an article by Colin Schindler. I've got no idea if you know who he is. I don't know who he is. But this was an article for Foreign Policy magazine. Jeremy Corbyn's anti-imperial nostalgia. The British Labour leader's worldview is antiquated, authoritarian and dangerous. I mean, I've got no idea who this guy is. Maybe he's like a marginal...
Someone who didn't read Corbyn's speech.
He might be a marginal dweeb. But the argument made about anti-imperialism is, that it's a frame that doesn't hold in the 21st century quite as well as it did at the end of the 19th and the first half of the 20th. Is it an old-fashioned ideology?
I don't want to just repeat everything I said about, the fact that this post-formal empire period of a few decades is literally a product of centuries plus of formal empire, and the fact that all those power relations are still existent, except to say that from the ideology of, I'm guessing what this guy's ideology is, I guess this sort of liberal mainstream view of the nature of Western power, of course it looks terrible, because to these guys the West is a force for good in the world. It's an upholder of these values, and we live in, if you ever talk to people in the defence foreign policy establishment, you will hear this phrase: rules-based international order that's delivered peace and prosperity since whenever, 1945. I mean, I went to one meeting with one of these groups recently. I've heard that phrase so much I can recite it in my sleep. This is how they think the world works, and this is how they genuinely think the world works. So when someone tells them, actually, no, it's a rules-based international order, but you violate the rules constantly. You use the rules to discipline the weak and legitimate you acting however you like, and then you violate the rules whenever you see fit. It hasn't delivered security at all. Ask the Palestinians if it's delivered security. Ask them about the rules. Ask people in Yemen if it's delivered them security. Ask them about the rules. Ask people in Iraq the same thing. Ask people in China if it's adhering to the rules that's delivered prosperity there, or if it's violating the rules of neoliberalism. No element of that phrase is true, but these people really believe it. So when they hear this stuff from Corbyn, this stuff that's critical of the global north, it really gets their backs up, because that's not how they see the world. They think the world of empire just ended magically the minute global south countries got to raise their own flags and sing their own anthems. It's a very simplistic view of the world, but it's the one they hold, and they just struggle to get a handle on Corbyn's worldview and treat him fairly. I think a lot of what's happening as well is that we've still got this issue in the commentariat that we had in terms of domestic policy from when Corbyn became leader, which is, I'm really getting the sense that these people have not thought seriously about what the left is like since the 1980s, and they're just rejigging this kind of, they're dipping into their big bag of 1980s cliches about what the left is really like. That's why they've got him down as someone on the hard left like George Galloway. You should be able to differentiate between different aspects of the left and be able to identify what kind of leftist Corbyn is versus what kind of leftist like Galloway or someone else.
So you'd say someone like Galloway is a sort of the Russia, Iran, who else is in that alliance?
He says himself in that
This is what Galloway says.
He says himself in that Ewan McCaskill article, I was pro-Soviet.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't understand why anyone would want to be pro-Soviet. It's a place was a dungeon. Why on earth would you look at the world like that? But that was his worldview. It's not Jeremy Corbyn's worldview. We don't need to detain ourselves with those kind of worldviews. They're not shaping Labour's foreign policy. They don't shape Corbyn's outlook, or I think the people around him, particularly like Abbott or McDonnell.
Let's go on to practical ideas. Not quite ideas, but what should happen? What will happen? What does Corbyn's foreign policy look like in practice? Imagine we survive all of these smears. We enter into number 10. How do we reshape global politics?
I think the important thing to remember here is that Corbyn doesn't stand alone in this. I think he's not only got the weight of the history of the Labour movement behind him in terms of understanding things in that power relation between the global north and the global south, but he's also got the entirety of the anti-colonial movement in the global south. And I think that kind of reorientating global politics will be easy enough once the will is there, and I think the movement and the shifts are there from, a state like Britain, which has had its hands in so many pies and continues to, and has been responsible for, countless amounts of atrocities. I mean, I don't need to really go into that, but I think that it really will be a domino effect, but also more importantly, it will be such an important shift, such an important change. I mean, America's falling apart, dare I say, under Trump and stuff. But I think that, moreover, I think that this consensus, this united front that the global north has had for a very long time, and an ability to harbour all of the power and centre it in the north is changing, it's shifting. And the minute it does, I really do see this reorientation happening. I'd be really interested to know what your opinions are on this as a scholar in this. But I think that once it happens and that reorientation happens, Corbyn and anti-colonialist movement as a whole will really come into its own, I think.
Well, I like this point. Let's dig down on this. So this is kind of the idea that there is a movement in the global south that's really strong, that's sort of ready to assert its force in global politics with sort of like liberationary effect. As soon as someone, potentially without someone in the West winning, but once you have someone in a power like Britain winning, it makes it much easier for that to come forth.
That's always been there. There's been resistance as long as there's been imperialism. There's been resistance as long as there's been colonialism, and it changes form, but it's always there. People are just naturally going to want to defend themselves against this kind of outside interference, violence, exploitation, etc., etc. Whether it's political, whether it's armed, that's just a constant. In the Middle East, there was Arab nationalism. There's been other forms of resistance. We've had aspects of the Arab uprisings in 2011. That was not just against local regimes. It was against local regimes as puppets of clients of agents of foreign powers. The sort of so-called pink tide in Latin America. Whenever we talk about Latin America, we just reduce it to Chavez, the personality. But there was this huge movement right through Latin America, the Southern Cone at least, which was a reaction to neoliberalism. Neoliberalism as a form of economic imperialism. Neoliberalism is an expression of the policy preferences not just of local elites, but also Washington as well. So that resistance has always been there. I think what as you quite rightly say, is new, is the idea I'm just trying to hold these two thoughts in my head simultaneously. Corbyn's policies are pretty mild. They're not radical. They shouldn't shock anyone, whether they're on the left or you're even a liberal. But that outlook of standing with the global south, that again shouldn't shock anyone, but compared to what we're used to, is a radical divergence. The idea that you'd have, I've thought about this before, the idea that you'd have someone in charge of a global north state, not just any global north state, no disrespect to like Denmark or Portugal, but the UK, world's sixth largest economy, home to the world's largest financial centre, some of the biggest corporations in the world.
Seat on the Security Council.
Seat on the Security Council. Unlike 95% of the world's countries, it's got the ability to project military power on an intercontinental basis. There's probably only 3 or 4 countries that can do that. Nuclear weapons, etc., etc. The idea that a country like that could be led by someone with an anti-imperialist philosophy, I don't think there's a single precedent for that. Anyway, I just can't think of that happening before in any of those 4 or 5 major states. So that is new. Whether he's doing anything particularly radical with his policies, it's still a departure and it's still exciting. And when you look at one of those big key speeches that I mentioned earlier that I think people should definitely read, the Geneva one in December 2017, that's him speaking to global south leaders and global south movements, and it's very much framed in terms of, if we get into power, we're going to be a force of solidarity with you, and here are the things that we're going to do to stand with you. So when you're exploited by international corporations, we're going to try and find ways to clamp down on that. So when you're losing much, much, much more in tax evasion than you get in aid, we're going to clamp down on tax avoiders. We know we've got tax havens within British jurisdiction. We're going to do something about that, and that's partly because we want to stand in solidarity with you, peoples of the global south. We're not going to be selling arms to local despots so they can pulverise you if you're living in Yemen. We're going to be stopping those arms sales so you've got the ability to live in peace, stuff like that. So a lot of that is really, really encouraging, and really, really new. And the extent to which he can successfully do that is going to be really interesting to see. Part of it is going to come down to whether politically he can do it if there are crises, and that relies on having an educated movement and having a public that understands what he's all about. So I think a lot of the work that needs to be done is Corbyn and people around him, people who support him, talking to the wider movement and generating an understanding of where he's coming from, and him, frankly, talking to the public a lot more and explaining where he's coming from. Stephen Bush, I like Stephen Bush. I don't want to be critical of Stephen Bush.
I like Stephen Bush, but the
Really?
last week he's fallen off.
Well, I think he's pretty...
I hope he comes back, but the last week I have not backed his analysis.
I think he's generally pretty professional,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
he's a good analyst, he's rigorous and he's fair. I don't share his politics at all.
Yeah.
But I think he
Friend of
does...
the show, to be honest. He comes on, he's very constructive.
We shouldn't be congratulating people for being professional and rigorous, but we are talking about we're talking about the British political media and particularly the Westminster lobby media, who would let's not even go there. But this recent thing he's written about Corbyn's foreign policy, in the Times, I find parts of it
Like
quite,
this is
quite
very
surprising.
professorial, David. You've sort of like got your papers.
No, this is just me being old. One of the things he says, and this is penultimate paragraph, and he's talking about what I just said. Corbyn needs to articulate his foreign policy more. He says, the other route to shut the reef down is a big speech in which Corbyn sets out his view of foreign policy. I agree so far. And then why he sees both common attributes and a shared value in the violent activities of the ANC, the IHRA and pro-Palestinian terror groups. Find me anywhere where Corbyn says, I'm all in favour of the IRA and its armed struggle, I'm all in favour of pro-Palestinian terror groups. Actually, when you look at Ewan McCaskill's article, he quotes a number of people who worked with Corbyn throughout the 80s and who said, I was with this guy every day, I never heard him talk in favour of armed struggle. He supported the political movements, he supported Irish republicanism, he supported the fall of apartheid, he supported Palestinian national struggle. Did he support violent attacks against civilians? No, he did not. So we need, if those of us who are sympathetic to all this, I think, to really start trying to connect with the public, educate the public about stuff like this, because they are, even by the best one, I think the best journalist in the lobby, they're being misled a bit. They're not being served well.
I mean, I suppose in defence of that article, actually, so you could say, obviously,
why are you doing this?
Well, obviously, Corbyn didn't have a penchant for political violence. Obviously, it wasn't something that got him going. But the critique that comes from the centre, which, I mean, I don't particularly agree with, but I think it's not completely ridiculous, is that how Jeremy Corbyn likes to frame his political history now that he's leader of the opposition is that he was there to try and make peace between the two sides. And what sort of like liberal ideology teaches us is that you're supposed to view every international political event as kind of like a sort of almost rational dispute that could just be resolved as long as people came to the table. And so what people will say about Jeremy Corbyn is, why was he at a peace conference in 2014 which was trying to unite the Palestinian factions, but not at a... I mean, he wouldn't have been invited to a conference that was trying to unite the PLO and the Israelis, to be honest. But I mean, it's not clear that was his priority. So I mean, how I would frame it is that what a radical anti-imperialist leftist, or a moderate anti-imperial leftist does, someone who's not a sort of ideological liberal, is you see that there's a weaker side in a struggle. And if there's two sides in that struggle that have legitimate claims, so say, for example, in Northern Ireland, or say, for example, in Israel-Palestine, then to achieve a positive outcome or a more just outcome, what you have to do is you have to give the weaker group more bargaining chips. And that seems to me to be something that the Western commentariat or the Western political establishment are completely incapable of understanding. Because the idea is you take them with, well, to be honest, we're not even taking Israel and Palestine at the level of power they currently have. We're financially supporting Israel, etc., etc. So I suppose what Stephen Bush is getting at there is, why has Jeremy Corbyn had such a different attitude to the Republican movement, to the Palestinian movement, and to the ANC than did anyone else in the political establishment at that time, who were probably all calling for, let's just have a rational debate and bring the two sides to the table, and trying to ignore the fact that actually what we're looking at here is a radical imbalance of power.
It's about who's an acceptable interlocutor, right? So I saw Marina Hyde. I don't know why I'm picking on Marina Hyde in particular. Maybe it's just because I saw this tweet where she says something like, why wasn't he reaching out to Israelis as well? Because Israelis don't need to be reached out to. They are already interlocutors and allies of and recipients of arms from the West. You don't need to reach out to them. You don't need to make the argument that Israel should be part of dialogue. It already is. The argument you need to make is that these people who are cast as beyond the pale, these people who are cast as we don't talk to them because, like Dick Cheney once said, apparently, we don't talk to evil. So Iran in 2003, in 2003, they sent a letter to the Bush administration through the Swiss embassy saying, look, we want to do a grand bargain with you. We want to resolve all the outstanding issues between us. We want to sign up to the Arab Peace Initiative on Israel-Palestine, which means accepting a two-state solution. We want to withdraw our support for Hamas and Hezbollah. Huge concessions, in return for which you recognise us and stuff like that. And apparently that letter got as far as the Vice President's office, and his response was, we don't talk to evil. You think how much pain could have been saved over the past 15 years if they'd done a grand bargain with Iran. And in fact, Obama came along and tried to reinstitute some of that by doing a nuclear deal. It's all about, do we talk to these people or not? Do we treat them as evil and beyond the pale and just pathological haters? Or do we say, this is an actor which exists, with whom there needs to be dialogue between them and the people on our side, and if there was that dialogue, there'd be less likely to be conflict. Simple as that. Should we have a situation where Sinn Féin can't talk on TV unless you've got an actor overdubbing their voice? It's a ludicrous situation we had in the 80s. Or should we just say, look, whether we like them, whether you like them or not, however you feel about Irish republicanism, they represent a constituency. It will be better to have dialogue between that constituency and ourselves and resolve things that way than pursue things through conflict. Same with the Palestinians. So I don't think we should get bogged down in this question of, do we like this group and do we like that group as a left, stuff like that. That's not really where he's coming from. It's more about, again, this thing that he keeps talking about in his speeches, which journalists seem just determined to ignore, using dialogue rather than conflict and trying to bring as many people as possible around the table. He does draw the line. He says you don't talk to ISIS. Remember when Owen Smith said you should talk to ISIS? When he's just winging it. Absolutely. We forget about him, don't we? What a clown he was. He made that statement. Corbyn said, well, hang on.
The left flank of Corbyn. Well, I suppose it's not the left flank to say you talk to ISIS.
It's just
sort of like the sort of crank flank.
It's the flailing incompetent flank. Even Corbyn said, well, no, that's a bit much. So he does have his boundaries, but it's a good general principle. Can you talk to people or not?
And I think I'd sort of add to that like the framing as well of one particular group and again the group that is, that of colonised people who have been socialised to be disassociated from their history and to sort of and are completely removed and treated as though they exist in a different context of their oppression, kind of framing them as savages and framing them as people who are just inherently violent is something that obviously is coached in so much history and is something that has been, deployed throughout colonialism and throughout, sort of imperialist strategy across the world. And I think that we have to be very mindful of that when we're entering this sort of discussion.
Yeah, that's really important, I think.
I think the last thing you said needs to be dwelled on slightly.
Yes, expand on that.
So looking at the media coverage of Corbyn laying a wreath at a ceremony for the PLO, I just think was actually one of the most disgusting things I have seen in the media in, I'm going to say my lifetime. It sounds wild, doesn't it? But I mean, when was the previous thing? I suppose maybe the Iraq War or something like that. I don't know. We're not going to look at what was it was fucking gross, right? So you had Jeremy Corbyn, who was there to commemorate, as we said, the 47 people who were killed, the HQ of the internationally recognised representatives of the Palestinian people. That was bombed completely against international law by the Israelis. And this was seen as an illegitimate event because Corbyn stood near the graves of someone called Atef Beseso. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that quite right, and Salah Khalaf. So if we look at these two people's histories, they were somewhat complicated, right? And they probably did do some bad things. So Atef Beseso was the PLO's liaison officer with foreign intelligence services. He potentially had some involvement with Black September, who were the people who carried out the hostage-taking in Munich, which resulted in the Munich massacre. But there was an interesting story about why it was that Mossad killed him in 1992. So this is from the book by Ronan Bergman. We can actually get that tweet up probably where there's a few extracts from it, but that suggests he was killed by Mossad because of his close relationship with Western intelligence. So the idea that this guy wasn't killed because he was a brutal, beyond the pale maniac, but he was killed because the Israeli government thought that he would lead, via his relationships with the West, to the recognition of the PLO as the legitimate representative. So at this point they'd been recognised by the UN, but not by America, and I think a few other Western powers hadn't to get recognised in the UN by a majority vote. So this is someone with a complicated past, but I mean, and it seems like Corbyn didn't actually mean to honour the guy, but take that into context. I'm going to get on later to the comparison. Salah Khalaf, he was number 2 in the PLO. Kind of like a Martin McGuinness character, so someone who he did have involvement in organising the Munich hijacking, which ended up in the deaths of lots of people. Obviously an awful event. But this was a guy who also was the number 2 in organisation which was recognised as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. Obviously a very complicated character. Obviously you probably shouldn't lay a wreath at his grave without really knowing the background of what's been going on. But we've had 2 weeks of coverage because of that one event. Now let's go back to 2014. Tony Blair speaks at the funeral of Ariel Sharon. You might not remember it because there was no media outrage. There was no 2 weeks on Sky News of saying how could someone possibly give a speech. This wasn't just laying a wreath. This was giving a speech at the guy's funeral. He called him I haven't got it written down, but it was like a titan of his country. So that's close to what he actually said. It was something along those lines. This guy held personally be responsible, not by some small niche human rights group, but by the Knesset, by the Israeli parliament, for the Sabra and Shatila massacres in 1982, in which the Israeli government, whilst there'd been a civil war between Israel and Lebanon, there'd been an agreement whereby the PLO left and went to Tunis. That's where they ended up getting bombed by the Israelis. but they left to go to there. Part of the deal was that Palestinian refugees could remain in Lebanon. Once the PLO had gone, Ariel Sharon, as defense minister at the time, was dropping flares into a refugee camp so that an extremist group, a far-right group of a far-right Lebanese party could go into that refugee camp and kill, over 2 nights, 762 to 3,500 civilians. Ariel Sharon had personal responsibility for that massacre. Tony Blair spoke at his funeral and called him a titan of his country. You know, he sort of said, oh, he's kind of a complicated character, but ultimately what was the reason he was at that funeral? It was to honour him, to see him as some powerful hero. And there was no media uproar whatsoever. Either that's because this attack on Jeremy Corbyn is politically motivated, because people don't actually give a fuck about what happened in Munich in 1972. I mean, it's an important event, but I don't think it was a passion of Dan Hodges before he got the invite to go on Sky News. Maybe prove me otherwise. Maybe he'd written an article on it before. I've got no idea. But either the reason that this has made 2 weeks of news about Corbyn, but it didn't about Blair, is because it's politically motivated by people that don't give a shit about international politics, or because the media are essentially racist and they don't care if a white head of state orders or oversees the genocide of quite a lot of brown people.
Well, look, if Corbyn did, it seems clear now that he didn't. If he did intentionally and purposefully honour the leaders of Black September, the people who ordered the Munich massacre, I think that would be a perfectly legitimate source of anger. And I think particularly in the context of, the failure to deal with this issue of anti-Semitism, which I don't think it's endemic in the left, but I think it's there and they haven't handled it properly. In the context of that, if it turns out that he honoured people who massacred Jewish athletes at Munich, that's the cause for legitimate anger. But I don't believe that Corbyn thinks Munich was a great idea and Black September were a great bunch of lads. There is that double standard with Blair and Sharon, but there's a wider thing going on here. It's not as if, Corbyn likes these terrorists and you're against that, but Tony Blair likes that terrorist and you don't care. Corbyn doesn't like terrorism, doesn't honour, I don't think he honours people for that. Probably honours those people to the extent that some of them were trying to push for peace later on, as Martin McGuinness did in his context. It's more the question of the fact that indiscriminate violence against civilians, including terrorism, is just at the root of Western power and has been for centuries, decades, centuries, up to and including the present day. Why restrict it to Israel-Palestine? It's just an absolute feature of the system. We talked about African colonialism in Africa before. When you talk about centuries of slavery, partly on which British prosperity was based, that's terrorism daily of people's lives. The use of physical violence to terrorise people into doing what they're told. These people are lucky to live into adulthood. Come to closer periods, 1950s, when there's an uprising in Kenya against British colonial rule, people are just indiscriminately herded into camps where they're subjected to just forms of torture that I'm not going to describe because I'll give people nightmares. You can read Caroline Elkin's book and she'll describe it to you if you've got a strong stomach. Really gruesome stuff. Places in Malaya, in Vietnam, again and again and again. Indiscriminate violence used to terrorise the population. In more recent years, I think the West has, the British did it in Dhofar. They poisoned it in Dhofar in Oman in the 70s, poisoning wells, killing livestock and all the rest of it to put down an uprising there, collective punishment. Crushed the Indian War of Independence in the mid-1850s. Again, collective punishment. You just see it again and again and again. It's a feature, not a bug. Come to the present day, and these things, I think, are less politically acceptable in the West. It's easier to draw attention to them because of the advances in technology and media and what have you. So it's now contracted out to allies. So you look at modern terrorism just in the last few years as perpetrated by allies of Britain, often with British help. then you can start testing people's real views on terrorism. So General Sisi, the guy who overthrew the democratically elected government in Egypt in 2013, what does he do almost immediately? There's a sit-in protest in a big square in Cairo, about 800 people. He has them massacred. Premeditated, massacre, 800 or so people killed in the streets. Amnesty International call it the worst massacre since Tiananmen Square. Straightforward state terrorism, one of the biggest acts of state terrorism in modern history. Sisi is an ally of Britain. Sisi regime is armed by Britain. David Cameron shook his hand a couple of years later outside 10 Downing Street. We continue to arm him. You know, Michael Fallon's met him. Theresa May and congratulated him in a recent election victory where he got 93% of the vote because everyone else had pulled out. The only remaining candidate was a Sisi supporter who was just standing there, said there was one other person in the election. Straightforward state terrorism carried out by forces who are armed by the British. Look what's happening with Saudi and Yemen right now. This, to me, because they've been doing it for 3 years now, it's not mistakes when the Saudis are killing people indiscriminately, when they bomb a school bus and all the rest of it. They're hitting civilians because, it seems to me, they're trying to terrorise the civilian population in parts of Yemen that are controlled by their opponents. They're using a blockade to collectively punish the population. That's a kind of structural form of violence, used indiscriminately to get a political outcome from the civilians that you're punishing. Same with Gaza, the blockade on Gaza. What's that all about? Ariel Sharon's advisor, Dov Weissglass, said we want to put the Palestinians on a diet. So what's that all about? That's structural violence imposed on a civilian population to get a political outcome. So what's really important, you raised it earlier, and it's, I think, really worth expanding on, is the role of violence in maintaining Western state power. It's absolutely a concrete central part of it, now more contracted out to local allies. But these guys have our help, they have our arms, they do this stuff with the arms we sell them. And that's really important to think about when we think about the nature of Western power. When we talk about terrorism, it's a tactic. States do terrorism as well. And the danger is not of being too condemnatory of terrorism by non-state actors, because I think indiscriminate killing against civilians is just always wrong. I don't care who's doing it, and I don't care what cause they're claiming when they do it. I don't care if it's Black September or anyone else. It's wrong. But pointing out the fact, what I think is important as well, is pointing out the fact that if we just call terrorism what bad people do, and then look at our violence as always justified or a mistake or something like that, we're just not talking seriously about violence. We're not talking seriously about terrorism. We're not talking seriously about indiscriminate killing of civilians. So when I see members of the British political class, commentators, opinion writers, talking loudly about how it's terrible what Corbyn's done because he's on the terrorists, when they've said nothing about Yemen, where Theresa May is literally providing material assistance to an indiscriminate campaign of mass murder. For 3 years the British government have been doing this. And you look at Aronovich, Cohen, Raphael Baer, I don't see the articles about Yemen. They're political correspondents, they're political commentators. Not written a thing about it. Ongoing support for terrorism, not one word. What about Sisi? Not one word. So if you're against terrorism, this thing that Chomsky used to say, I've read Chomsky for ages, but this thing's stuck in my mind. If the West is against terrorism, great, stop participating in it. So fine, condemn the terrorism of other people. I can do that. Anyone can do that. So, fine, good. But if we're serious about it, let's concentrate on our own, because that's what we can stop. We can stop that Saudi war. We can stop these other forms of violence with the influence that we have as a major state.
I'm going to start taking questions in the comments soon. Well, now you can start writing them. While you write them, while you think of them, Huda, for you are about to go into the belly of the beast. Ooh. Potentially, if you were lucky enough to win your NEC election. What we have been seeing a lot of in the last couple of weeks is a debate where some people are saying it's time that Corbyn has to put his foreign policy principles front and foremost. There's no way that this can be something that's done by the back door anymore. So I suppose that many people in the Labour, probably most people in the Labour Party, think we're going to win the next election on domestic policy, and the idea is, if you're Corbyn, is probably you win it on domestic policy, but then you bring about this sort of like just foreign policy out of the media spotlight. There's another argument. So Paul Mason wrote an article a couple of days ago where he is basically saying the Labour Party should give up on foreign policy for 5 years at least and just do domestic policy. So it's this idea that the number one priority is to reverse neoliberalism at home, and from that basis, so maybe in 5 years' time you can do something progressive. Although, I mean, depends if you agree with Paul Mason's foreign policy. Friend of the show, we're definitely going to get him on soon to talk about his foreign policy suggestions. It's definitely worth debating. Yeah. But the question I want to go to really is, how do you see the forces lining up in the Labour Party, and how do you see the argument developing in the Labour Party about whether to hold strong with an anti-imperialist foreign policy that is going to elicit media attacks and potentially sort of, let's say, burden us with huge media debates that aren't going to win us many votes? Or do we park that and just say, look, we're going to stay in NATO, we're going to do Trident, we're basically going to have the same foreign policy as before, but we probably won't start any mad wars? Do you see that as a struggle that's going on in the Labour Party? What side do you fall on? How are you going to fight whichever is your cause?
I think any attempt to say that international politics and domestic politics are two separate contexts, I just think it's misguided, because even if you want to look at it through, like, only through the lens of domestic policy, you're how much money is being spent on international, policies and foreign policy and sustaining wars that we don't have to. And I think that the two are inextricably linked, and I think that the basis of all of this and what is exciting right now in the Labour movement is that the people who've struggled against colonialism in Britain have been erased, and there has been a systematic struggle in which the state has tried to do that. And I think now we're seeing a resurgence, and I think it's not just Corbyn, I think it's what Corbyn represents, and what Corbyn represents to a lot of people, and what has been alive for a very long time, particularly in ethnic minority communities, but just throughout the left internationally, has been that tradition of internationalism, and it is coming back to the forefront. And it's coming back to the forefront because as when you talk about neoliberalism and this idea that we can dismantle it singly in Britain when it's upheld by an international system and it's upheld through a global order that's pretty much pitted down and forced throughout the world, particularly on the global south. I think that the left has some way to go, of course they do, but I think in centering people who are facing oppression, and centering people who struggle it is, particularly when we talk about the Palestinians that we've been mentioning throughout this conversation, the fact that they have been completely made invisible in their own struggle. I mean, this idea that they have no history, no value, and that, starting all the way from their expulsion in 1948, things are changing. I think things are coming back, they're being revived, and they're being revived because of our principles. And there's a history of collectivism that we have, and I think that, again, that's been brought to life, and that's what makes this so exciting. And we can never just let it fall and rest on a couple of people. I think we have to all take the responsibility to take up this struggle and take up the point of recentering those who are, in effect, being systematically brutalised across the world. So I completely rebuke this idea that you can separate domestic and international policy, because they are linked, and ultimately any kind of domestic policy that we want to do ultimately will tie into what we are standing in the international world. So I think that they are linked, they will forever remain linked, even if we want to put them in tiny neat little boxes. But yes, I think there's a lot to do, but I think that we're making those strides, and that's what's exciting. There's
luckily a question that actually links quite well to that point, and also links to an interesting conversation I was having with you, David, earlier in the week, which is about how the connections between Corbyn's foreign policy and Corbyn's domestic policy might not actually be that mutually supportive. So I'm going to read it as it's written. Oliver Foster: how can we stop supplying weapons when our GDP, growth targets, relationships and resource needs necessitate it?
They don't.
Ooh, interesting.
I don't understand why he thinks that.
Well, the question, what we were talking about earlier was how a dramatic shift in Britain's foreign policy, especially vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, for example, could have a feedback effect on the British economy.
Okay, there could be some kickback from Saudi Arabia. Okay, that's true to some extent. I
mean, the point about supplying weapons, right? I mean,
it doesn't make a huge amount.
Doesn't make a huge amount of difference.
And it's lucrative up to a point, but there are better ways to earn money. There are better ways to earn export income. It's a industry which receives a huge amount of state support. This is not the free market. This is the nanny state that props up the military industry. Huge amount of state support, state subsidy, support from British ministers going out and acting as salespersons for the British arms industry. If you look at the amount of money that Britain makes from exports of goods, visible goods, services and what have you, to the Gulf, the arms exports don't make up a huge amount of that. They might make a difference in a particular year. Britain had a particularly good couple of years for these over the last couple of years with regard to Yemen. So we've done particularly well because of the war in Yemen. We've helped kill lots of people, so that's been great for business. But generally it doesn't make up that much of the overall total. There's all sorts of other goods and services that are sold to that part of the world. And there's frankly more efficient ways of making money, for Britain to make money in terms of exports of goods and services, than propping up this nanny state dependent industry. I think it's overplayed the importance of arms export to Britain economically. The thing we were talking about the other day was this thing that slightly concerns me. So the Saudis put a lot of investment capital into Britain. And Britain's got this quite precarious balance of payments. Sterling has been particularly vulnerable since Brexit. Remember, sterling crashed the day after the referendum, and then when Theresa May gave her hard Brexit speech at the Tory Party conference a couple of months later, it crashed again. So people are quite worried, investors are quite worried about whether they can have confidence in the British economy anymore. One of the things that's helping to prop up sterling, despite the trade deficit, is capital flowing in from the rest of the world. And the Saudis are net providers of capital into the British economy in terms of bank deposits, equities, etc., etc. What if they decide, if Corbyn says we're no longer going to support you with regards to Yemen, what if they say, okay, we're going to liquidate our sterling assets, see how you get on in terms of your balance of payments then? That is a worry up to a point. I think there's investment capital coming in from elsewhere in the world. We've got the world's biggest financial centres. We shouldn't be too worried about being able to finance a current account deficit in those terms. I think they'll be sending a big message to the Americans and the French about how reliable an ally they are if they treat an ally as close as Britain in this way. So, but it's something Labour have to think about. We have to war game stuff like this. If we're going to pull those arms exports, what can the Saudis do in response, and how are we prepared for that or not? But I think that's the way they could hurt Britain. I don't think it's to do with the value of the arms exports themselves. And the arms exports, in any case, are not really, what the arms exports are really about is maintaining the British military industry. Britain needs a domestic military industry to remain a global military power.
Mm-hmm. So you think those exports are for strategic reasons, not economic reasons, and if we change our strategy, then obviously we change our sort of strategic relationship to these countries. Huda, I'm trying to find who asked it. I can't find who asked it. I'm sort of scrolling up. You're someone who might soon be sitting on the NEC. The decision will probably be made by the time you arrive, but what do you think about Labour accepting the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism with all its examples? There was obviously a hashtag Twitter storm this evening, which was, I think, hashtag back the code or keep the code
or something. Yeah, I think that we have to be completely hard and come down really on anti-Semitism. Of course we do, as any kind of other forms of racism. Being a black person myself who exists in the Labour Party, I've come across all kinds of different barriers, particularly in the student movement, and I think that we need to be absolutely hard on that, but it should never be to the cost of any other kind of oppressed people. And it should never be to criminalise or to silence, which I think IHRA doesn't intentionally do. I don't think it's set about to do that. But I'll give enough good faith to say that. But I think that that is the result of it. And I think that what the Code of Conduct tried to do, and I think it was right in trying to do, was take the elements of the IHRA, which are internationally accepted, which are, good in terms of coming down as concrete.
We should be careful with internationally accepted, right?
Yeah. But I kind of mean
showing
that,
an Arab state that accepted.
No, of course. But I kind of by internationally accepted, I kind of mean that it's in all of our minds, and it has been. Since it came out, because it was a massive sort of press conference around it. It was a sort of massive build up around it, and I think that again, it was about trying to stamp out anti-Semitism, which is something that we are all for, and that we have to all be for, and I think we have to all unite around. But I think that those edits that could be made and caveats that could be made to protect other communities, I think that we're all in this together. I think we're all in this together in trying to fight all kinds of different forms and intersections of oppression, and that there isn't this bad sentiment and bad blood and all this other sort of stuff, I think is not going to help us in that mission. I think that the case has sort of been put forth that within the new Code of Conduct in trying to take a hard stance and come down on anti-Semitism, and I think that consultation also is the way forward with that in order to again rebuild trust and rebuild faith. But I think ultimately speaking, it can never be to the detriment of another community, and the only reason why that can even happen is again because of everything else being coached in this idea of completely erasing and making invisible Palestinians in this struggle.
Can we try and pin down what precisely is wrong? Because it's that one example, isn't it, that we're apparently stuck on.
So the example is
racist endeavour.
An example which, because one problem with I've tweeted a lot about the bloody IHRA definition, but one problem with it is that lots of the explanatory or accompanying examples, it starts with quite a vague clause, which is to say that these are examples of statements which could, in a certain context, constitute anti-Semitism. Which means that for supporters of it, they can say, oh, well, we'd take into account that. My problem with it is it puts under suspicion anyone who sort of talks in this way. And the contentious one, I think, is the final example, might not be the final example actually, is the one where it may be anti-Semitic to deny the Jewish right of self-determination, i.e. calling the creation of a state of Israel a racist endeavour. That was the one that was excluded from the Labour Party Code of Conduct. All the other ones were either excluded or slightly reworded. And I think the only real disagreement now is about that one example.
So I think the problem with this is, and let me preface this by saying, the left and Labour do have a problem with anti-Semitism. It's real. We've all, we can deny this or not, we've all met these people. We've all dealt with them at meetings. I've had remarks made at meetings. I've seen banners on marches. We've seen it from day one. And this is not just our political opponents saying it. It's people on our own side. It's Corbyn-led Jewish people saying, no, this is real. People like Mike Segalov, Ray Wolfson, Rachel Shabby, Judas don't do awareness sessions on anti-Semitism for the left because they think the left hasn't got a problem with anti-Semitism. I don't think it's endemic, but it's there. And the bigger problem is the denialism, this aggressive kind of denialism we're getting where, and as a person of colour, I recognise this when white people are telling you this racism isn't real. It's like, I've seen this one before. That being said, I think we have to be careful, as you absolutely rightly said, that when we're combating this, which we absolutely have to do, we don't throw the Palestinians under the bus in the process. And with that example, saying people who deny the Jewish right to self-determination might be anti-Semitic. Yes, correct. But then, it then says, for example, by describing a state of Israel as a racist endeavour. Well, hang on a minute. Why would you do that? Why would you describe the state of Israel as a racist endeavour? You can absolutely understand why there were people who thought it would be a good idea to create a state of Israel. Because of, even before the Holocaust, hundreds of years of anti-Semitism threatened the very existence of the Jewish people. Of course there were going to be people who thought it would be a good idea to have a homeland, self-determination and safety. Anyone with a basic sense of empathy should understand where that was coming from, whether they agreed with it or not. The issue is that there were also a people on that land who also had the right to self-determination. It's not just a question of the Jewish right to self-determination, which is absolutely unarguable. It's the fact that the Palestinians have an equal right to self-determination, and this whole issue is about what's the format. Is it a binational state, a single binational state? Is it two states on the 1967 borders? What's the format that allows both those people to have the equal right to self-determination, the equal right to security. And what that thing does, what that example does, is effectively say there's no debate, there's no clash, there's no Palestinian right to self-determination. You either accept that the State of Israel should exist, must exist, there's no problem with it being set up because the Jews need a right to self-determination, or you don't, in which case you're a racist. But you might just question Israel because you think, well, they're also Palestinians and they also have a right to self-determination. And the way Israel was set up was actually racist towards them because it was effectively, we want the right to self-determination, so we will have it. And if these people are the price to be paid for that, so be it, because we care less about them as people. That's racist.
The response would be that's a claim about the state of Israel instead of a state of Israel. I mean, I think the distinction kind of breaks down. But I don't want to dwell on this for too long because we have done a couple of shows on it already. So I'm going to have a question for each of you. I like this one. Are China and Russia imperialist?
I think yes. Yeah. And I'm just hesitating because I've heard people saying no, but I don't really understand why. I mean, they're big powers, they're big capitalist powers which use their military power, diplomatic power, economic power to dominate and violate the sovereignty of weaker states. They absolutely do that. So I don't see why we shouldn't call them imperialist. I mean,
so my follow-up.
What does Russia look like to a Syrian at the moment? Not like an anti-imperialist power, I would argue.
So as a follow-up, if you look at Britain now, we're currently in quite a strong system of alliances. We're part of NATO. That's a particular block in world politics. Corbyn comes to power. Do we join a new alliance? Do we go it alone? What do our international allegiances look like after a Corbyn government?
As far as he's concerned, Britain's staying in NATO. That's the official position. I don't think it's his position, but it's the official position. In my view, if you've got a North Atlantic Treaty Alliance which exists to defend the free world against the threat of communism, which is supposedly the idea, why is it still there 25 years after communism ended? And why was it still there through that entire period under Yeltsin and under Putin at the beginning of Putin's reign when Russia was an ally? What were we defending the West against during that period? Why did NATO get bigger when there was no antagonist for NATO? What NATO is a forum whereby the West can project its power internationally, where the Americans can project their power into Europe and solidify Europe under American leadership, American military leadership, and where America can dip into that alliance to build coalitions for projecting power into the global south. That's what NATO is. If it was about defending the West from Russia, then it would have disappeared in the period where the West was supporting not just Yeltsin but supporting Putin as well. People forget the West supported Putin when he was pulverising Chechnya, whereas Corbyn opposed that. People forget that. I think I don't know if I think it should be dissolved or not. I don't think we should be part of it because that's its character. It's not a defensive organisation. And I think the big problem that the West and Russia have is something that needs to be dealt with through de-escalation and dialogue rather than squaring up to each other on the borders of NATO and Russia, rather than conducting military exercises on each other's borders, not blaming. Nothing that NATO did justifies what Putin did to Crimea, has done to Ukraine, but there is a dynamic and we're contributing to that dynamic, and it would be great if we could de-escalate that dynamic between the West and the East. That doesn't mean joining another alliance, it doesn't mean lining up with Russia, China, what have you. It means being more independent, I think.
This isn't a question, but I've been reminded by something I did want to do a shout out for. Jyoti Wilkinson says, give a shout out to Derby Transformed, the biggest thing to happen to the East Midlands since trains were invented. It will be that. It's on the 1st of September. Me and Ash will be there. I think she's doing a talk in the day, and we're both hosting a quiz in the evening. Loads of people are there. Grace Blakely's there. Paul Mason is there. Maybe someone could have a debate with him. I don't know what they're talking about. I don't think it's foreign policy they're talking about. Anyway, it's getting kind of late. So you're going to have your final thoughts in a second. First of all, please, if you want new media to become really fucking big media, go to support.novaramedia.com.
Enormous media.
Enormous, yeah, big motherfucking enormous media, which doesn't just deal in poorly researched gossip, as so much of the mainstream media does at the moment. I mean, I'm not normally the one who obsessively bashes the mainstream media, but I have to say I have been disgusted over the last 4 weeks about what I have seen. All right, it's been a while. Final thoughts, Huda.
I think that foreign policy for too long has been seen through the gaze of the West, and I think reorientation needs to happen. I think that a Corbyn-led government will be a great effect to that, and I think that I'm excited for it, as a lot of other anti-colonialist, anti-imperialists should be.
David.
I want to go back to this thing that was said earlier. Do we continue? Does Labour continue with the foreign policy it has, or does it just concentrate on domestic? I think anyone who's thinking Labour could just concentrate on domestic is kidding themselves. Britain is an international power. Like it or not, it's in those institutions. It's a major shareholder of the IMF. It's in NATO. It's on the UN Security Council. It has all this military power. It has all these alliances. It has a foreign policy, whether you like it or not. It's what you do with that matters. There are going to be crises. There are going to be instances happening in the world under a Labour government. It's going to have a response. The idea you can just batten down the hatches is this isn't serious politics. And apart from anything else, as I've said before, Corbyn's outlook may be radical. It shouldn't be radical, but it's different, which says more about the status quo than it does about him. But his policies are not. When you look at his policies, when you go through the manifesto, when you look at those speeches, these people who say we should de-radicalise Labour's foreign policy, point to me in the Geneva speech. What's wrong with it? Point to me in the Chatham House speech, the manifesto. What's wrong with these stances? What's radical about these stances? And above all, look at the polls. How is this damaging Labour? Labour's on 40%. Look at the polls after that Manchester bombing speech. It didn't harm Labour at all when he took this stance about foreign policy affecting terrorism. So I think these people need to keep their nerve. If they think this is too radical, I wonder what it is that they want.
Hold your nerve, kids. Thank you both so much for joining me tonight. Thank you for watching Tisky Sour. I've been enjoying your comments. Keep commenting on the YouTube after it re-uploads. If you want to have a continued conversation about the topics we discuss on Tisky Sour throughout the week, we have just created a Tisky Sour Facebook group. So you can search that. You know how to spell it because it's on the video you're watching. So if you want to join that, I'll see you in there. Until then, thank you, David Waring. Thank you, Huda Elmi.
Yes.
We'll be back same time, same place next week. As ever, go to support.novaramedia.com. This was Tisky Sour. We are Novara Media. I am Michael Walker. Good night.